Okay, so today we're gonna take a look at the top 3 things that you need to do before you take off with your Mavic Mini 2. Now there's a lot of things that need to be done before you ever take off with the drone, and there's some things that you should definitely double check before you get this drone in the air. So I wanna go over a couple of things to hopefully help you prevent either A, losing, or B, crashing this drone. Let's get started. What's good, everybody? Ken here, you're watching OriginaldoBo. Today we're gonna go over the top 3 things that I recommend doing before you take off with your Mavic Mini 2. Now this is going to be really more of a beginner video, but if you're somebody who's an intermediate drone pilot, you may still find some use out of this video. So first things first, let's go ahead and jump right into the menu system and talk about the return to home altitude. So the return to home altitude is really important. This is something that I've seen several pilots make mistakes on. They don't come in here and set the RTH altitude each time that they fly. Now there's not one size fits all when we're talking about return to home altitude, but if you go into the menu section and you go under safety, it's literally the first thing that you're going to see. It says auto return to home altitude. Now I have mine set at 275 feet. One nice thing about the Mavic Mini, it does break this down in feet instead of meters. 275 feet is pretty reasonable if you're flying around a suburban area, but if you're in the city, you may want to set this taller than your highest object around you. So if you have an object that is 400 feet, you're going to need to set your return to home altitude to at least 426 feet. Now, with that being said, you want to make sure that you're abiding by any local regulations, rules, and restrictions. So if you're not a 107 pilot, you may not be able to get away with this legally. Again, if you're flying in an environment where you see there's a pillar or a pole, you want to make sure you give yourself enough clearance to be able to clear that in the event that you either A, have battery down and it's going to return to home automatically, or you lose sight of it and you need to hit the return to home to get it back to you safely. This needs to be able to clear any and all obstacles. Again, it's not a one size fits all, so you're going to have to be mindful of that when you are turning this on. The second thing you want to make sure that you've done before you take off with your drone is make sure that you have the correct number of satellites available to you. Now, what I've noticed with the Mavic Mini 2 is that it takes a little bit of time before it achieves the appropriate number of satellites to safely take off and make sure you're locked in positioning mode. Remember when I wrecked my Mavic Air 2, I took off at about 5 or 6 satellites, and that wasn't enough for it to have a locked position. The end result was it smashed into a side of a building and ended up having to replace the Mavic Air 2. So to prevent that from happening to the Mavic Mini, you want to make sure you have at least 9 to 10 satellites. Now, being inside right now, I have 12 satellites available to me. So in theory, I should be able to arm the props. And I could take off if I wanted to. I probably shouldn't though. The next thing that you're gonna wanna do has to do with when you are actually getting in the air, but it's easier to make sure that these configurations and settings are done on the ground before you ever take off. Now we're gonna jump into the camera configuration. While this doesn't have anything to do with safety, this is going to really control whether or not you're going to be able to get those great shots and affect the overall result in the end. So let's go ahead and jump into camera. When we're in camera, we're gonna go ahead and turn on JPEG plus RAW. Now, why are we doing this? If you're a beginner, well, maybe some of you are familiar with editing RAW photos, and having a RAW photo is definitely a lot better than having a JPEG. You can push those files a lot further, you can edit them much easier and pull out a lot of color and highlight details along with the shadows. So I highly recommend turning on JPEG plus RAW before you ever take off. It's better to have a backup of a JPEG. If you want to share the file directly from your phone, JPEGs work great, but it's nice to have that RAW file in case you want to do a little bit of post editing. The next thing I do, I set my size to 4:3. This is going to make the most out of that 12 megapixel sensor. That's also going to give you the highest resolution photo. If you set it to 16.9, you're not going to get the best resolution, the best bang for your buck from the 12 megapixel camera. So because of that, set it to 4:3. You'll notice that it's going to be slightly crispier. It's also easier to share those to Instagram. The other thing that I like to do is turn on my histogram. This allows me when I'm shooting manually to see my exposure. Ideally, you want to sort of line up directly in the middle. With this drone, because it doesn't have desync-alike and it doesn't have log, you don't want to really have that histogram exposed to the right. If you look here on my screen, you'll notice that my histogram is actually underexposed. Now, if I set this to manual, it's really underexposed right now. And let me bump my ISO up and you'll see. So right now, this is sort of in the middle. Those mountains are directly in the center here, and this is technically properly exposed. But as I adjust my shutter down further and further, you'll see that peak goes all the way to the right. You don't want that. That's overexposed, and you don't want that peak to be too far to the left because that's underexposed. So ideally, you want to make sure that mountain is sort of right in the center, just like that. Those peaks in the center, that means you are properly exposed. That's the job of the histogram, and it's going to help you get some really great shots. The last thing I like to do is put my grid lines on. Using the rule of thirds when you are filming or photographing things allows you to get decent composure. Not only that, it makes for interesting shots. If you don't have your grids on, you really can't tell where you're at in the frame. And sometimes what we tend to do is just put everything in the center. Now, it's not a bad idea to also have a good point of reference for the center, and turning on your center spot along with the grid, that definitely does help in framing. I do that all the time because if I'm pulling up from something and I want to have some sort of symmetry, having something in the center works great. But then there's often times where I'm filming something like a tower. I sort of want to have it in one of the boxes to the left or to the right. I don't want it directly in the center of my frame because that's just really boring. See, I'm sort of off to a center. No, I guess I'm in the center. I can't even say that. That doesn't work here. I'm in the center of this. But you get what I mean. It's going to make for some interesting shots. Alrighty, so at this point, you are ready to go. You are ready to take off and start flying. Your resolution and frame rate is going to be totally up to you, whether you shoot in 4K or 1080p or even 2.7K. I don't think you can go wrong with this. The colors definitely seem to be a lot better on this drone, but having those couple of things checked before you take off and making sure you have the right amount of GPS satellites is going to improve your flight and also make sure this thing comes back in one piece. Take it from me, I've crashed a ton of these things. And it's not fun. It also gets very expensive, especially if you don't have DJI Care Refresh. But hopefully this video helps you if you are a beginner. And if you are a beginner and this is your first drone, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I'm going to put out more videos just like this in the very near future. And if you're one of my existing subscribers and you just learned anything new, well, cool. And we'll see you again Wednesday for Drone Brews. Stay original.